Now, I usually speak about fatty acids and lipids. That's an area of study in my laboratory, and I'm going to leave that to Chris Masterjohn because he's, after all, the lipidologist, right? So he'll speak on that a little bit more. I had too high a GPA. I wanted to be a lipidologist. I had a 4 in high school, except for that typing class. But today I'm going to talk about another topic I unfortunately don't get enough opportunities to discuss, and that's related to issues surrounding exercise while following a low-carbohydrate diet. And trust me, there's probably more mythologies and misconceptions surrounding exercise than anywhere in the clinical literature, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of sort of sports nutrition and the high carbohydrate paradigm to get us rolling here. So my as far as introduction here, some of you may know my colleague Steve Phinney, who I'm very, very fortunate to work closely with over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years or so, and we wrote a book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living that was published last year. And we made a strong case for the fact that people who are insulin resistant are very suitable for low carbohydrate diets because that manifests itself functionally as a form of carbohydrate intolerance. So these, of course, as you know, are people with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Most people who have some form of obesity have a degree of insulin resistance, and that's who we really wrote the book for. But it's really a continuum of insulin resistance. So if we look at the other side of the continuum, the people who are insulin sensitive, those are primarily the athletes and people who are normal weight. So you might ask yourself if low carb works for people with insulin resistance, and of course we have a lot of evidence for that. Is it really necessary or effective for people who don't have insulin resistance? And that's what I want to touch on today. My sort of cliff note answer would be yes, there is a case that can be made, and that's why we really wrote our second book, which was just released a couple months ago, called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. Both books very complementary. The second one much shorter and targeted really for active individuals, not just the elite athlete, but anybody really interested in following low carb and being active. So briefly, my goal today is to convince you that carbohydrates are not an obligate nutrient in the diet. You've heard already in lectures that carbohydrates are not essential, but there is this belief if you're exercising, you need carbohydrate for fuel. And I will hope to show you that given at least a couple weeks of adaptation to low carbohydrate, you can reduce it from an obligate nutrient to an optional nutrient. And furthermore, show you how this could actually enhance your performance, allow you to train harder, perform longer. And another aspect of exercise is recovery. And there are many reasons why low carbohydrate diets might enhance your ability to recover. Okay, a little history. If you consider that we've been promoting low carbohydrate diets for general health and dietary recommendations for the last 3 or 4 decades, the history of high carbohydrate diets for sport, it really goes back even further. Some of the first evidence that carbohydrates were important go back to the Boston Marathon, where they actually measured blood glucose levels in marathoners after the race and showed in 1924 that they were significantly decreased. And this led some researchers to postulate, well, let's provide carbohydrate to these athletes the following year, and they did so, and it improved their performance. So that was sort of the first inkling that carbohydrates might be important. And you have to remember, back in 1920s, we did not have the understanding we do today about the importance of glycogen and fuel use and muscle and so forth. We were just starting to understand some of the biochemistry. And there wasn't a lot of follow-up work immediately, but in the 30s and 40s there were pockets of researchers in Scandinavia and other European countries who were looking at higher carbohydrate diets and showing a connection with better performance. But it really wasn't until the late 60s where really Scandinavian researchers were leading the sort of the sports nutrition discipline, and they reintroduced the muscle biopsy technique, where you actually snip a little piece of skeletal muscle out of a person and you can study glycogen and carbohydrate metabolism. And they did a series of experiments really showing high carbohydrate diets were linked to better performance. Now, of course, the Achilles heel with a lot of this work is that they never put athletes or any of their subjects on a low carbohydrate diet for more than 3 or 4 days or a week at the longest. So they did not really allow adaptation. So after that, that really started the high carbohydrate paradigm for athletes. There's many researchers over the next several decades that really made their careers studying carbohydrate metabolism during exercise. Ben Saltine, Lawrence Briet, Dave Kostal, see their photos there. Many others, dozens and dozens of very prominent exercise physiologists and researchers continued to study high carbohydrate diets. And you may have heard of this sports drink. Around this time, Gatorade was developed down at the University of Florida, and the football players, at that time it was originally developed as an electrolyte replacement, but quickly they introduced carbohydrate into these drinks. And you all know this is now a billion-dollar industry, where there's many other sports drinks out there, energy drinks, and almost exclusively they use carbohydrate and simple sugars, maltodextrin, as their source of fuel in these drinks. Now, if you ask yourself, where's the innovation here in the last 30 years, and I would say there really hasn't been much. I mean, we use sucrose, we use glucose, we use fructose, maltodextrin, and this is viewed as this is the standard in sports nutrition to enhance endurance performance and strength performance as well. So I want to talk to you about what I think are sort of the next milestones, if you will, in this historical evolution of sports nutrition, and talk to you about two things. The first is a new sports drink that I've been involved with called Generation UCAN, and that'll lead me into really the majority of the talk. I want to discuss how we can talk about restricting carbohydrate and its effects on performance in the face of 3 or 4 decades of research that have promoted just the opposite. Let me first talk briefly about an issue that has come up a couple times, and I know John mentioned this, so thank you for teeing this up, because he very appropriately told you that exercise is not a very potent weight loss tool. And some of the very best evidence for that comes from studies done in identical twins. And this is an incredibly well-controlled study, metabolic ward study, where they took identical twins, so they have the same DNA, and had them locked up, and they actually did overfeeding studies, and I don't have a graph here of this, but they specifically overfed twins. But in this particular experiment, they had twins exercise 2 times per day for an hour each, so 2 hours per day of exercise, 6 days out of 7 days, over a period of 3 months. And what you're looking at in this graph is the weight loss in the twin pairs. Sometimes people have a hard time calibrating their brain on this graph here, but you've got one twin on the x-axis, the other one on the y-axis. Now, if you do the math here and you believe in 1 pound of fat equals 3,500 kilocalories, these twins should have lost about close to, I think it was almost 10 kilograms, so about 20 pounds, a little over 20 pounds. And you can see here that no twin pair lost the expected weight. A few twin pairs came close, but look at the one twin pair that lost not even 2 kilograms, exercising 2 hours per day. I mean, that's a prodigious amount of exercise for 3 months, and that's all they got out of it. And again, this is not a free-living study. All this was highly controlled. So the couple points here. One is that the response to exercise, at least in terms of weight loss, is highly variable. The between twin variance is 3 times the variance within twin pairs. So when we preach exercise to people as a weight loss tool, unless unless you know for sure that this is one of the twins that has the genetic profile where they are a responder, it's not really appropriate, I think. And John very articulately mentioned that we shouldn't make people feel guilty that the reason they're obese is because they're not active, because it's very likely they will not respond well in terms of weight loss. Now the question is why? How could this be? You're expending energy, and we have this common belief that exercise increases our metabolic rate. You've all heard that, I'm sure. You hear it all the time on TV. You hear it in the media. Even my research colleagues think that exercise increases your metabolic rate. But I won't show you the data, but I could show you 4 inpatient, highly controlled metabolic ward studies that have all shown endurance exercise done 300 to 600 kcal expenditure per day decreases your metabolic rate. And that explains why you don't see the expected weight loss. Now, I will qualify that. That's endurance exercise. We do a lot of resistance training research in our laboratory, and that is a different story. When you increase lean body mass through resistance training, we have seen increases in resting metabolic rate. Sometimes that graph, as I said, is hard for people to understand. So this is the exact same data presented differently with the twin pairs here, and you can see that the first, on the far left, that poor pair of twins is just not responsive to exercise at all, and most of the twins are not losing the expected amount of weight. So more generally here, the status quo, and this is really the status quo as of May 2012. I mean, this is what most athletes believe, that carbohydrate is an ideal fuel source. And in sports nutrition, it's very vogue now to talk about windows of timing and with nutrition. So when we look at a workout, we can look at the pre-exercise period, during exercise, and the recovery or post-exercise period. Regardless of the window of time here, carbohydrates are encouraged. So when we look at pre-exercise drinks, they're all sugar-based. With a prolonged endurance exercise, you really have to aggressively consume gels and other fast-acting forms of carbohydrate. And then the belief is that after exercise you got to refill those glycogen stores and sort of jumpstart the recovery process. So we again advocate for these very fast-acting, insulin-stimulating carbohydrate sources. Let's look at fuel sources in the body, though. You probably know, but in case you don't, we did not evolve to be able to store carbohydrates to any great extent in the body. We store very little in our blood. We have a couple teaspoons of sugar in our blood, and we have a small capacity to store sugar as glycogen in muscle. And you can see about 500 grams of, that's actually on the high end, of carbohydrate can be stored in skeletal muscle, and maybe another 100 grams in liver. But compare that to how much fat we can store. It's even in the leanest athlete. Take an athlete that's 3% body fat. You've got even in that case 40-fold or maybe 25-fold greater amounts of fuel in your fat tank than you do in your carbohydrate tank. And that, that fat that's stored in adipose tissue is readily accessible. It's an efficient way to store energy because it's got 9 kcals per gram versus 4 for carbohydrate. It's also stored without water. Every gram of glycogen that we store is stored with 2 to 3 grams of water. If you think we tend to, we don't want fat, right? We're trying to get rid of adipose tissue, but from a fuel perspective, for sports and performance, fat, it might be a better fuel. It's a larger fuel tank, and it reduces that need to consume carbohydrate during exercise if in fact you can tap into it. And you've all heard of the hitting the wall, right? Also referred to as bonking, and I realize that talking to some of my European colleagues that bonking has another definition. So I use bonking here. But what is bonking? Any marathon runners here or triathletes? So have you hit the wall before? Anybody?
Not since low carbing.
Exactly. That's one of my sort of sound bites here. Is you can make yourself bonk proof by following low carb, but maybe you don't want to be bonk proof.
4 kids that like.
There you go. Well, what is hitting the wall? It's a fuel crisis. It's your body running out of carbohydrate sources for fuel, and we tend to focus on the muscle and when we look at fatigue, but it's really a fuel crisis in your brain. Your brain, when you're eating carbohydrates, is reliant on glucose, and when you're out of glucose and you're at 20 miles or wherever, your brain is starving and it shuts down, and you have these intrusive thoughts of carbohydrate, and you curl up in the fetal position, or you're running with whatever energy you have to a Dunkin' Donuts to fill that need for glucose in the brain. But what's the irony here? The irony is when you hit the wall, you actually have tens of thousands of calories on board by way of your fat stores. You just can't access them. So which fuel tank do you want access to? Your glycogen tank? You've always got access to that, but it's limiting. How do you get access to your fat fuel tank? Because it's a physiologic truth that even though your glycogen's gone, if you haven't adapted to a low-carb diet, you still cannot access that fat fuel to perform exercise. So let's look a little bit closer at how we access fat for fuel. And this is by no means a simple process, and I always hesitate to oversimplify processes because many factors contribute to lipolysis and fat breakdown. But I'm always amazed at this graph because clearly there is a dominant regulator here, and that regulator is insulin. And this is a graph of insulin versus fat breakdown or lipolysis. And these types of elegant experiments have been done repeatedly, and you will see that relationship is not a straight line. It's a curvilinear or exponential relationship, such that at sort of the break point there, you see just small changes in insulin can result in dramatic changes in fat breakdown. And that's well within the physiologic range of insulin. That's the difference between going out and exercising in a fasted state or where you've drinking water versus consuming Gatorade or consuming a bagel before exercise. That would easily move your insulin levels up, 10, 20, 30 picomole. And that has, again, a very profound effect on your fat mobilization. And it's not just fat breakdown. The same type of graph exists for fat oxidation, fat burning in muscle. So insulin is a dominant hormone controlling lipid metabolism. And there are other hormones as well playing a role, but clearly insulin's the one that's putting the brakes on mobilizing and oxidizing fat. So the whole logic of sports drinks and consuming carbohydrates before exercise is that it actually promotes carbohydrate oxidation, but it inhibits fat oxidation. So if that's your goal, that's the last thing you want to do. And this is a bit redundant for this audience. You know, why should we be concerned about the sports drinks that are sugar-based? Well, they spike your blood sugar, and that often leads to a rebound hypoglycemia and low blood sugar. And this is not just for sedentary folks here. We all are familiar with this sort of roller coaster spike crash phenomenon, but this is also a concern for athletes if you consume a pre-exercise sugar-based drink. And the problem is, low blood sugar is not tolerated well. It causes fatigue, and it's legitimately a stress response, and it's related to hunger. The sugar spike itself is obviously followed by an insulin spike, which, among other things, shuts down your fat breakdown and oxidation. But a lot of these sports drinks, because they're simple sugars, have a high osmolality, so they're hypertonic. And a lot of endurance athletes in particular that are taking these gels and drinks by the truckloads are having a lot of GI distress because of the osmolality of the solution, and that's something that is related to stomach distress and GI distress. So this is sort of the downside of sugar-based sports drink. Because of the osmolality, they decrease, they slow rather gastric emptying, and are associated in many people, many athletes, with gastric distress. And that's why Gatorade can only put so much sugar in their solutions, because they are aware of keeping their product hypotonic. So it has less particles in solution than the blood. But that means people have to redose with the Gatorade frequently during exercise. And of course, as I've mentioned, blocks fat breakdown. So I like to use this car analogy as to what might be a better situation if you do want to use sports drink. And I like fast cars, and I think it's an appropriate analogy. But you think about your gas tank, and if you want optimal performance out of your car, you don't want to empty your entire gas tank into your engine at one time. It'll flood. So you have fuel injectors that spray a little bit of gas every time your piston goes up and down, and you get nice, good fuel mileage and performance out of your car. Well, think of the same thing with your intestines. If you consume carbohydrate, you don't want all that glucose to be dumped into your bloodstream at once. That's overkill. What you really want is a slow release form of a carbohydrate, if you're going to consume carbohydrate at all, that is released in a sort of time-released manner out of the intestines, that provides a steady fuel for muscle, and that would theoretically be associated with better performance. Not to mention, it would not stimulate insulin to the same level, and potentially then not inhibit fat breakdown and oxidation to the same extent. So what would a more ideal sports drink look like? And truthfully, almost all the sports drinks out there are fast acting. They're intended to be absorbed quickly to provide fast energy. Again, I would argue for those reasons that you really want one that's absorbed slowly, that doesn't stimulate insulin, so it doesn't block your fat breakdown and oxidation. And of course, based on those two, you might think, well, fiber, that's released slowly, but fiber doesn't actually get absorbed, right? It doesn't provide fuel, energy. So the third point there is you would want it to actually provide 4 kcals per gram like other carbohydrates and be fully absorbed. So here's the fascinating story that I'll just take 5 or 10 minutes to just describe to you. GSD, it stands for glycogen storage disease, and this is a very rare but very serious genetic disease that afflicts about 1 in 25,000 kids. So it's rare, and it doesn't get a lot of attention because it's rare. as far as research and funding and so forth. But this particular form of glycogen storage disease, 1A, is due to a single gene defect in the liver. The gene there is, or the actual enzyme that is defective is glucose 6-phosphatase, and this is an enzyme that's responsible for converting glycogen to glucose. So these poor kids cannot convert glycogen to glucose, and they literally have to be fed every couple hours. So you can imagine, as a parent of one of these children, how devastating this would be. You have to literally live by the alarm clock. Every night you have to get up every couple hours to feed your child. Oftentimes they have tube feedings. And if you miss just one dose, you end up in the emergency room, or worse. So the founder of this company that I'm going to tell you about has a child with this disease and has, a goal of curing the disease and initially just better managing the disease. And so they discovered and created this form of carbohydrate that provides extended glucose maintenance. And they've have a trademark that they call this particular carbohydrate superstarch. And it's actually a group of researchers from Scotland who screened hundreds of different types of carbohydrate and put them through various proprietary processes, heat-moisture process, that changes the way these carbohydrates are digested. And they came upon one that gave the best result that, again, is termed superstarch. And the company that now has commercialized this particular starch is called UCAN Company. And I do consult for this company. And the actual raw material for this product is a waxy maize cornstarch. And there's nothing unique about that. You probably all have it in your kitchen cupboards. But this was the standard treatment for kids with glycogen storage disease. They would consume raw cornstarch, and that would give them a couple hours of glucose maintenance. But with this new proprietary form of superstarch that goes through a very meticulous heat-moisture process, the studies indicate it provides up to 8 to 10 hours worth of glucose maintenance. So this is literally a lifesaver for these kids and the families, and in terms of just reducing the stress and better management of the disease. Well, the company quickly realized there were applications outside of glycogen storage disease for this type of carbohydrate, and so they initially focused in the sports nutrition space, and I think as of about 2 years ago have been commercially, have a product commercially available that they're selling to athletes. And it's a very large molecular weight carbohydrate, and because of that it has a very low osmolality, and so it's very gentle on the stomach. But the really unique aspect of it is that it has a very low glycemic index, so it's absorbed very slowly, and it also provides extended glucose maintenance. That was sort of the key with these kids with glycogen storage disease. It's not a resistant starch or fiber, so it's completely absorbed, minimal impact on insulin, and therefore avoids this spike and crash phenomenon. And this is an example of the glucose profile after ingestion of, I believe this was 35 grams of the starch. And there's been clinical studies done on this in the glycogen storage disease literature, as well as in type 1 diabetics who have trouble with nocturnal hypoglycemia. So let me switch gears a little here and talk about burning fat during exercise. And incidentally, we have published one study with the UCAN in athletes showing that it does in fact promote greater fat oxidation during exercise compared to an equivalent amount of maltodextrin. And so there's a lot of high-profile athletes and collegiate and professional sports teams now that are using UCAN, and I really think it's going to be a game changer in terms of a real innovation in the sports nutrition and sports drink industry. But in sports nutrition, there's always been this understanding or appreciation that if you can train an athlete to burn fat more efficiently, that's a good thing because it spares glycogen. And so there's been many different approaches or strategies to enhance fat burning. And you can see a few of those there. You know, these are the fat-burning formulas, the Firestarter and Ignite and so forth. You know, these are also weight loss applications here, but many of the athletes are using these to potentially burn more fat. And if you look in the literature, there's some support for things like caffeine and green tea extract that, you know, they have a subtle effect on shifting your metabolism over to burning more fat relative to carbohydrate. But compared to a well-formulated low-carbohydrate diet, this is like a pea shooter versus a bazooka. But very little research on low-carbohydrate diets compared to, say, caffeine, where you can find hundreds of studies done examining the effects of caffeine on endurance, performance, and metabolism. But I'm going to share with you what we do know about low-carbohydrate diets and performance. And again, I'll mention Steve Phinney, who was, you know, been a pioneer in the area of low-carbohydrate diets in general. But what fascinated me most about Dr. Phinney, before I even met him, when I was interested in low-carbohydrate diets in the early 90s, was that he actually did a study in athletes. And you know, many of you might be aware of his work done in the early 80s with keto adaptation and understanding, you know, the physiologic adaptations. But one of those studies was actually done in high-level cyclists. So he's had an interest in performance as well as the clinical applications as I have. So he wrote a very nice review paper. It's one of the really only peer-reviewed papers out there on this topic in Nutrition and Metabolism back in 2004. And in that article, and you know, Steve and I have had many long discussions about low-carbohydrate diets, especially related to performance. But this idea, you know, goes back well before Steve's work. And some of the best evidence that we have that people can perform large amounts of exercise on virtually no carbohydrate are European explorers who came to America and lived among the Aboriginal groups here, and the Inuit, for example. And Schwatka was one of the most well-known and wrote about his experiences and really alluded to what we now know from science, that to really perform in the face of very little carbohydrate requires at least a 2 or 3 week period of adaptation. And you can read the quote here. So this was rather fortuitous, and we now understand that this is a necessity. And Steve actually coined the term keto adaptation to describe this process. So what is keto adaptation? You heard a little bit about ketones yesterday. They're very misunderstood among physicians and healthcare professionals and dietitians. You heard about the difference between nutritional ketosis and ketoacidosis, so I won't go over all that. But keto adaptation is a process that occurs over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. It's a very well-orchestrated, coordinated set of metabolic adaptations that occur. It's rather remarkable, really. And there's been some tremendous research on keto adaptation, mainly in the context of starvation, done back in the 60s and 70s. And what happens during the first few days of starvation or very low carbohydrate diets is that the body starts to break down fat at a very high rate. A lot of those fatty acids get delivered to the liver, and they get converted to ketones. The ketones initially start to fuel the muscle, but after a few days, the majority of the energy for muscle is derived from fatty acids, and the ketones are actually spared for the brain. So it becomes very good brain food. And when ketones are above about 1 millimolar, the brain can extract over half of its energy use from ketones. So it's not a glucose-dependent organ. It's only glucose-dependent if you're consuming carbohydrates, but can actually adapt to using ketones and lactate very efficiently. And the whole idea here is that the process of keto adaptation could have a lot of benefits for athletes. That's why I'm here today to sort of make that point. So one obvious point that we've already talked about, hitting the wall, is a fuel crisis in your brain. You know, it's running out of fuel, glucose. So keto adaptation, as I said, makes you bonk-proof because you've got almost an infinite supply of fuel now by way of ketones to fuel the brain. And as the gentleman mentioned, and countless other athletes who we've put on low-carbohydrate diets have articulated the same type of sensation. They don't hit the wall. They are sort of impervious to that phenomenon, which is so common when athletes are focusing on carbohydrates. The other point is that athletes who are consuming a lot of carbohydrates are also generating a lot of reactive oxygen species. And we know that burning fat is more efficient. It's associated with less generation of these free radicals. And the primary target of these free radicals are membranes, highly unsaturated fatty acids in membranes. And that's related to insulin sensitivity. So better protection of these highly unsaturated fatty acids like EPA, DHA, arachidonic acid actually preserves cellular function and insulin sensitivity, which is important in recovery. There's evidence that ketones are protein sparing. So there's perhaps an anti-proteolytic effect of ketogenic diets. Decreased central fatigue, I won't go into the sort of biochemistry behind that, but there are mechanisms of fatigue related to increases in serotonin in the brain with prolonged exercise. And low-carbohydrate diets actually increase branched-chain amino acids in the blood, which compete for tryptophan transport, which is a precursor for serotonin. So we often hear about less central fatigue. Because you're not burning as much carbs and glycogen, which is the precursors for lactate, there's less lactate and hydrogen ion generation. Also less ventilatory drive due to the lower RQ associated with being in a ketogenic state. And the improved body composition that goes along with it over time is even relevant for power and strength athletes who benefit from a higher power to mass ratio. So a little bit more on ketones here. We talked about this concept of nutritional ketosis, which in my mind really starts at about 0.5 millimolar. If you're eating any amount of carbohydrate, you're probably closer to 0.1 or 0.2. And then beyond that, anywhere up to maybe 3 millimolar, is an ideal range for being in this sort of ketone zone or this ideal, state of nutritional ketosis to fuel the brain during exercise. And then, you all know ketoacidosis is a whole other animal. That's when you're above 10 millimolar, and that just doesn't happen in a healthy person who's not diabetic. So this is Steve's study he did, at least published in 1983, where he took a group of very high-level cyclists. These guys had very high VO2 maxes, adapted them over a 4-week period to a ketogenic diet. And you can see each line here is an athlete. At the time, the thought was you take carbohydrates away from these cyclists, their performance is going to go in the tank. Yet he actually showed no change in performance, but you see dramatic difference in their RQs. If you're burning exclusively fat, you have an RQ of 0.7. So 0.72 there indicates these guys were performing exercise, and the level of exercise they were doing, they were burning almost 1,000 kilocalories per hour. So these guys were not recreational athletes. Steve took biopsies, measured glycogen. You could see before the ketogenic diet, they had high glycogen as you'd expect, and that depleted over the course of 2 hours of exercise. But when they did the same exercise, keto adapted, notice that glycogen wasn't totally depleted. It actually was about 50%, but the slope is much less. So there's tremendous glycogen sparing going on because they're burning fat. So this is the conventional view of peak fat burning, and I just want to get through this because this is kind of the, I think, really interesting and fascinating work that has gone underappreciated. This is the conventional view of, how you would measure somebody's ability to burn fat. If you do a submaximal exercise test and measure fat oxidation, you tend to get a curve like this. So somewhere around 60%, give or take, depending if it's trained or untrained. 60% of somebody's maximal oxygen consumption, that's where they peak out in terms of the number of grams of fat they can burn per minute or per hour. And once you start to exercise harder, yeah, you're burning more calories, but you're burning mainly carbohydrate. So let me go back to Steve's study here. I'm sorry, before I do that, this is probably the largest, most accepted study done looking at a large group of athletes and their peak fat burning. Actually, there's sedentary and athletes in this group of over 300 people. So the group average in peak fat burning during exercise is 28 grams per hour. And just to give you the range there, the highest person in that group, which is an elite athlete, was 60 grams per minute. So that's largely considered the fat burning ceiling. Here's the data from Steve's study. The average was 90, 1.5 times the highest person that was in the other group, and they're consuming carbs. A couple of the athletes were burning close to 2 grams of fat per minute, so almost 120 grams per hour. So we've shattered what was largely considered the peak fat burning ceiling by adapting an athlete to a very low carbohydrate diet. And just finally, I think this is my last slide. I've been interested and personally been involved more with resistance training. So we've done similar work with athletes participating in resistance training. And this is just one variable we've looked at. This is the percent change in body fat. The first two groups there are diet-only groups, so low carb versus low fat. These are very well-controlled diet studies. And we see greater reductions in percent body fat with low carb versus low fat. No big surprise. But the two other groups performed 12 weeks of very high-intensity resistance training, progressive resistance training. And resistance training in general helps whether you're following low fat or low carb in terms of body composition. But the best results are achieved with the combination of low carb and resistance training. It's all like an additive effect. Low carb is really great at burning the fat off, and then you add the stimulus of resistance training to low carb, and that helps protect the lean tissue or even increase lean tissue. And if I cherry pick the best responders out of that fourth group there, the low carb resistance training group, this is their individual changes in body composition. So Fred, asked you, can you convert fat to muscle or vice versa? And of course, not at the cellular level. But the question that I would ask is, can people simultaneously lose fat and gain lean tissue? So a lot of my colleagues say, no, that's not possible. You can't be in a catabolic mode in your fat cells and an anabolic mode in your muscle cells. But here's the data. This is from DEXA, so gold standard in body composition. These are 4 athletes in that resistance training low carb group, lost 20 to 30 pounds of fat in 12 weeks. So that's pretty impressive. I mean, not unbelievable, but I mean, that's pretty darn good. But what I found really astounding is this is their simultaneous changes in lean body mass. So it's not an anomaly here with one subject driving the mean. This is a common response. It's physiologically possible. We were not using steroids or any other. This was a low carb diet with a pretty standard resistance training program that was supervised. I won't talk about this so we don't go too far over time, but there are athletes out there. They're not always open. I think there's a lot of closet low-carb athletes, but there are a few. Marty Fish is notably one who's attributed a lot of his success. He's the #1 ranked U.S. tennis player. Lindsey Vonn, an Olympic skier, and arguably the best athletes on the planet are these racing sled dogs. And they burn fat. That's what they burn. That's how they win the Iditarod races. They're burning fat. So you can read through my summary, and I'm happy to talk with you all after the lecture here. Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you, Dr. Volek.